much. And hello, everyone from across the globe. I just want to say first and foremost, thank you to Miguel and Francisco for putting on this incredible event. I think it really fills us with a lot of hope that not only is there, a lot of community within the foresight field, but that so many people registered for the events across the last 2 days and tomorrow. It is through foresight that I believe we'll get to the other side of the global pandemic and what's to follow. So thank you so very much for their hard work in putting together what is a fantastic, fantastic event. I'm honored to be a part of it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I do have some slides. And I'm just going to share the whole screen and go ahead and do slideshow. There we go. So hopefully that's showing up for everyone. So the title of my presentation today is 2020 Hindsight, How Foresight Failed to Prepare Us for a Pandemic. And of course, failed I have in quotes, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. My name is Yvette Montero Salvatico, and I am principal at KEDGE and the founder or co-founder at the Futures School. You can see my contact information on our websites below. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and I'll show this screen or this slide at the end as well in hopes that we can all connect after the fact. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about how I thought about this session. And so when I thought about creating the content for this session, my thoughts were around this description. And, you know, we're all trying to seek clarity amidst this really unprecedented pandemic. And it's clear that there were many organizations, many governments, many individuals really caught off guard, unprepared to deal with a global crisis of this nature. But in reality, all the signs of this potential worldwide health emergency were there. The science was clear, the data was available. The failure, it seems to me, was in the inability of individuals, governments, organizations to fully imagine and immerse themselves in potential future worlds. And by doing so, incite meaningful action in the present. So my proposition in this presentation is that foresight, when practiced well, allows us not just to, do tools and frameworks, but ultimately alter perspectives for positive change. So what I'd like to share with you over the next few minutes is how we can create more resilient, adaptive, and transformative leaders and organizations that are prepared not just to get past a pandemic like we're facing now, but more importantly, but to leverage disruption and to find opportunity for transformative change. That's really our mission at the Future School, is to democratize foresight, to make it available to everyone, because we believe if we do that, the world will be a better place. So I'd love to share with you how I believe we can empower and create agency in this unique time of change, but also more importantly, long before we have a pandemic or other crisis. So I'll definitely leave some time at the end for questions, but feel free to use the question tab and area as we go along to type in your questions as you think of them. So before we get started, I want to be respectful and acknowledge that everyone on the line may not be practicing foresight at the same level. So just as a grounding, I wanted to share this slide that provides a level set or a foundation on how we define strategic foresight. So for us, strategic foresight provides us a framework to identify emerging trends and issues, and then use that information and insight to map out possible futures. Because from where we stand today, there's multiple futures, probably a number unable to be counted, right? So we need to map out those possible futures. Those well-informed maps are going to allow us to test our strategy, develop breakthrough innovations, and ultimately create transformative change. So I'll say this again later. Foresight isn't really about the future. It's about today and creating meaningful action today. So again, for those of you that might be new to the field, welcome. We need all of you. When we talk about strategic foresight, you might be surprised to know that it's being used across all industries and functions, from governments to nonprofits, corporates to startups. In fact, I started my foresight career at the Walt Disney Company, where I was Disney's futurist. And I'm happy to share more about that experience and journey, because working for Disney is pretty cool. When is foresight used? You might be surprised again to know that it's not just in strategy. I think it's most famously used in strategy with things like scenario planning, but foresight is very helpful in innovation, in change management, and in personal development. All of the tools within strategic foresight, all of the frameworks, are not only applicable at the organizational level, they're also applicable at the individual level. So if you're looking to map your career, if you're faced right now with a career crossroads that you weren't expecting, foresight can help you figure out where to go next. Mine the external environment for informative data and be able to make better decisions. I'll talk a little bit later today about how we use foresight, which is our natural foresight framework. It includes 4 facets: discover, explore, map, create. And of course, there are other frameworks in foresight. I'll just talk a little bit about ours later. And then ultimately, why is it used? Well, usually I have to spend some time on this, but in the current environment, I think it's pretty obvious why we need foresight. Ultimately, it allows us to not just survive, but thrive in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And it does so by allowing us to become more resilient, more adaptive, and more transformative. So more resilient when we're trying to keep our official future alive, and we're trying to keep the status quo, which in some business environments, that's what we need to do. It allows us to be more adaptive when we face a disruption that we weren't expecting, and allows us to pivot to have successful outcomes. And ultimately, foresight should allow us to identify those threats before they become threats. And so that allows us to identify those opportunity areas for better transformation. And that's the part that excites us the most here at KEDGE and the Futures School, is that opportunity for transformation. We talk some about risk, and I'll talk some about risk in this presentation, but we love the opportunity side of it. So that's a little bit about what foresight is and how it's used, where it's used, when it's used, and again, just a level set. So if this is such a great field and such a great practice, why aren't we seeing it used in a lot of more places? Why didn't foresight help us get ready and prepare for this pandemic? So I want to talk to you today about several reasons I believe, and I've seen through my experience, why foresight efforts fail. And we'll go through them one by one, and I'll describe how we can offset or counteract that, because ultimately we believe that, again, the world would be a better place if everyone practiced foresight. So before I jump into the reasons, again, we usually have to provide some type of business case here, but in our current situation, it's less needed. Clearly, our traditional processes, our tools, our methodologies, the way we organize our companies and our governments are becoming industrial age relics. Something fundamental has changed. And this was true before the pandemic. Let's be clear, the change was afoot way before COVID. COVID is bringing to light some of the major systematic issues we faced for quite some time. We've entered what many are calling the post-normal society or post-normal times. This is where we're talking about a great shift in human and organizational development. It's like we're not where we were, we're not where we're going, we're somewhere in between, and it's very, very uncomfortable. My friend Tanya Schindler this morning talked about dancing with uncertainty, and that's definitely one of the characteristics of this new post-normal time, this feeling of uncertainty. And so foresight helps us not just cope with that, but leverage it. I wanted to just point you all to a few publications that my business partner and I have had the opportunity to write for, that talks a little bit more about post-normal and how we can leverage post-normal attributes and the environment for greater success. And I just felt like these readings might be helpful. So they're all in Rotman Management Magazine. This one's a few years old, but it's still really relevant. We published this piece called Wicked Opportunities, 7 Shifts in the Age of Opportunity. And it really talks about reframing the idea of wicked problems. For those of you that aren't familiar with the term, a wicked problem is a complex problem that when we try to solve it, we end up creating more problems. We're faced with a lot of wicked problems right now. And the idea of wicked opportunities is changing our relationship with complexity. So complexity is not the enemy, but rather affords us greater opportunity for change and transformation. And Frank Spencer in his talked a lot about that aspect. So this is one article we wrote for the disruptive issue as well, how embracing a transformational mindset can help you be successful. And then last, we talked about creating value in a post-normal world, also in Rotman back in the spring of 2018. So if you want to know more about any of those pieces, feel free to check those out. And I think you'll find them pretty useful. So back to the topic at hand. Why do so many foresight efforts fail? One major reason is they have a risk management charter. So I mentioned earlier that there's nothing wrong with using foresight to identify threats and risks. That's critically important. But when your foresight efforts are focused solely on risk management, we have a problem. Risk and resiliency is what we need to be looking at. The only way that we can grow stronger, wealthier, and more resilient as a society, as a species in the long run is to expose ourselves to more risk and volatility today. I know this sounds ridiculous, but let me give you a really basic example to showcase this. They have shown through scientific study that our playgrounds for our children that today they're unable to play on because of the current situation, but our playgrounds have been made too safe. We've made our playgrounds so safe that our children are unable to deal with any type of failure. We've lowered the height on the slides, and we've removed all of those fun playground contraptions that you and I probably played on. And the result is we have young adults that have more anxiety, more fear of heights, and an inability to recover from failure. Ultimately, we need to expose ourselves to some risk. And here's where strategic foresight comes in. It acts as an immune system. So we need to balance the risk side of it and recognize that foresight through scenario planning and its other tools help us identify new threats and opportunities, test possible outcomes in a safe environment. This is why Royal Dutch Shell was able to leverage scenarios back in the 1970s to not just weather the oil embargo crisis, but propel itself to the top of the industry because they had tested out the possible outcomes. They didn't get it exactly right because we can't predict the future, but they got it close enough to when things started happening, people weren't paralyzed. So in addition to thinking about foresight as an immune system, the other way to avoid this failure is to look at foresight and the future across a spectrum. So the push and pull of the future is a framework that's very, very helpful in identifying both the fact that we need to look at the threats and the issues, but also look at our aspirations. So the future exists across a spectrum. On the push side of the future, you have the threats and emerging issues. They're going to push us to the future, maybe kicking and screaming, whether we like it or not. And that's the side of the spectrum that most people and organizations focus on. And why not? It's right in our face and we want to react to it. And I'm not saying that the push of the future is not important, but we can't ignore the other side of the spectrum, which is the pull of the future. And this represents our aspirations, the fact that by identifying where we want to go, we can actually pull that future to today. It's why we named our firm Kedge. It's a smaller anchor on a sailing vessel. When there was no wind at sea, they would use that kedge to pull themselves to their desired location. And as I said, what we find is doing foresight work, you can pull that future to today. So applying foresight in the right way, in the appropriate way, means that you're leveraging all sides of the spectrum. You're looking at the push side with threats and emerging issues. You're looking at the pull side for aspirations. On the push side is more about resiliency. Towards the center, we're talking about adaptation. And on the pull side, we're talking about transformation. So you could see adaptation, resiliency, and transformation that I talked about earlier is across this push and pull of the future spectrum. So that's how we avoid the first failure, potential failure, is having a risk management charter. We understand the risk side of it, but we also focus on creating the future. Fear sells, but you only get a short-term reaction. If you want to convince people to be engaged in foresight work long-term, you have to engage them in creating a future that they want, not just fearing a future they want to avoid. Second reason why so many foresight efforts fail. they stop at the tip of the iceberg. It's so tempting to focus just on trends and on pop futuring. But the problem with that is that those don't even represent the future. Trends, by very nature, are here. They don't represent the future, they represent the present. So trends are just the beginning work of a foresight professional. So we get many of our clients that say, wait a minute, we already do trend reports and consumer insights and forecasts. What are we missing? I love this analogy that I think came from Dr. Jay Gary back in the day, where we talk about, like, if you start at the soil testing level, this is where trends, consumer insights, and behavior comes into play. Then in crop diversity, if you use that analogy, you continue that analogy, you're looking at industry, competitors, signals of change. But at the topography, at the 30,000 foot level, this is where we see external driving forces, patterns, and alternatives. Foresight covers all three levels, but really begins in that topography level, so that we can see the broader landscape before drilling down into what we know to be true today. Said another way, we can't just look at trends because they're already mainstream. So a good futurist looks towards what the value shifts in society that predicated that trend were, and what are the implications of that trend. So I love this life cycle of a trend because it keeps us grounded. Yes, much of our scanning happens in that red space, but as good futurists, we become really in tune with asking the question why, and identifying the values that would have preceded the trends. And then when we get really good at this, we're able to say, here are the value shifts that are going to result as a result of this trend or issue. So if you're doing good foresight work today in the midst of this pandemic, you're not just asking, why did this happen? You're also asking what's next in terms of what value shifts might be taking place around collaboration and communication and solidarity, as well as potentially more nationalism and more closed off environments. So all of those, this provides an incredible opportunity, this current crisis, to really be able to take stock and understand what might be happening next. The other thing I want to say about trends and not stopping at the tip of the iceberg is that futurists and foresight professionals are excellent pattern and sense makers. They recognize that trends don't exist in isolation, that trends, like everything else in this complex environment, collide and mesh and interact with one another. So to really understand what's next, futurists make sense of those collisions, make sense of the dance between trends in all domains: social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. And we're able to see, if you will, the constellations in the night sky. So again, second reason why foresight efforts fail, they stop at the tip of the iceberg. They don't ask why, they don't explore value shifts, new narratives, and the collision that patterns and sense making allows us to identify. A third reason why so many foresight efforts fail and why we might be in the predicament that we find ourselves today with COVID is that they operate in isolation from the rest of their ecosystem. We see so often well-meaning efforts within governments, institutions, and organizations to stand up and create a department of the future, a minister of the future. And the problem with that impact is that, or the problem with that approach is that it fails to recognize that one key element of any successful foresight effort is competency building. You have to build capacity, foresight capacity within the organization, institution, within the group that you're working with. Because ultimately, when we treat foresight efforts like an app that we download whenever we think we need to think about the future, we fail. We need to instead think of foresight as our operating system. It should run in the back of everything that we do, behind the scenes of everything we do: strategy, innovation, but also leadership, education, learning and development. Foresight should fuel it all. And this is how you get past this idea of executive entertainment. When you have an isolated foresight division or a ministry of foresight that stands apart of everything else in the ecosystem, you end up often falling into this executive entertainment trap, where the only information developed and delivered by the division is stuff that reinforces what the leadership believes or wants to believe. This is happening a lot right now, and it's really dangerous. Foresight professionals, futurists have to have a lot of courage, because generally what we're saying is not super popular. So when you stand up a division that's separate from everything else, you run into the risk of doing this. Ultimately, if we sequester our foresight efforts to one part of the organization or one part of our government, it ignores the culture development, the capacity building that then ultimately results in an environment that creates a roadblock. So what happens is well-meaning divisions create amazing foresight work. They release it into the organization. It's attacked by the antibodies, and that work goes nowhere. Ultimately, foresight is change management. I know it doesn't sound super sexy, but it is. And culture cannot be copied, benchmarked, or Googled. We joke all the time this idea that we're going to just Google another company that's been successful and we're going to copy everything they do. If at Google they offer ball pits and ping pong tables, and if my organization does that, we'll be innovative like Google. Well, that's not the case. Ultimately, culture has to be developed, and a foresight culture is no different. So while we recognize that foresight is a discipline, we believed it's best served as an integrated philosophy. And if you intentionally develop a futures culture, not just in your organization, but in your community, in your state, in your country, then you'll be primed for not only market-leading innovation and successful opportunity and more revenue, but just more success, more transformation, more positive outcomes. I think this might be the last one that I talk about, this why foresight efforts fail. This one might sound a bit counterintuitive. They focus too much on the future. And so what do I mean by this? We have to recognize that our systems and structures that are in place today value short-term wins over long-term decisions. That's the case in almost every situation across every country in the world. A quarterly deadline is always going to take precedence over thinking about the future. And so you're going to lose your funding, you're going to lose your focus if you're not able to help people understand the connection between the future and today. And they're connected. In fact, I love this quote that says, "The future is not an empty space, but like the past is an active aspect of the present." So we think of time, we should think of time as a timeline, and just as real as the past and the present seem to us, the future is the same way. We have to think about the future as a place we can populate with new ideas and new approaches, and we have to be able to transport ourselves and our stakeholders to that future so that they can make better decisions in the present. Ultimately, how we think about the future, or don't think about the future, directly impacts the decisions we make today. I cannot emphasize this enough for those that are new to their practice of foresight. Being able to connect the future and foresight to today is critically important. If your stakeholders just believe, this is another exercise for a 20-year scenario, or to imagine potential futures 10 years from now, you aren't going to get the traction. And that's not what foresight is about. Foresight is about creating those visions of the future in order to inform our decisions right now. We're all creating the future with the decisions we make today. Foresight allows us to be more optimistic, potentially more aspirational, and more collaboratively about those decisions, so we can create better futures together. So ultimately, how do we ensure that we're successful despite all these potential failures? We need to think of this as a mindset, and we need to have a new breed of thinker in our institutions, our organizations, our communities. Individuals that can create a new map and new maps for innovations, possibilities, and opportunities. So in our practice, we believe in democratizing foresight and democratizing the future. So I want to share with you this strategic foresight primer, which we've offered for free since we published it. I think it's 8 years ago. We've revised it continually, and I just want to make this available to everyone who is listening. If you're interested, just email us, or you can find it on our website as well to download. It has job aids, references, really great practical advice for applying strategic foresight. It is really focused on our natural foresight framework. With just the last few minutes that I have, I just wanted to take you all through it because I understand from some of the questions coming from the other sessions, there's a lot of interest in actual frameworks and tools. So I'm just going to go for a few minutes longer on this and then open it up to questions. So our natural foresight framework is built upon the concept of S-curves and natural growth curves and the panarchy. You don't need to know that, but I share that because it is built around success in complex environments. So these are not steps, but rather facets from which we pull from to build whatever process we're looking to achieve. So depending on what you're trying to achieve with your foresight work, whether it's innovation, change, strategy, then you would pull from different aspects of this framework. So we have discover, explore, map, and create. And I'm just going to go through each one briefly and share a couple of tools regarding it. So with discover, we're talking about context and background. We're uncovering both personal and organizational assumptions around the focal issue that's in question. And so these things are the tools that we might use here are, of course, causal layered analysis, ladder of inference, unconscious bias modeling. And here's why this is so critical. Many foresight processes tend to skip this phase, and it's very, very detrimental. Ultimately, when we approach change only from the landscape of today, it's like looking through a keyhole. My business partner, Frank, has a whole skit around this. But, and when you look through a keyhole into a room, you're very limited in what you can see. And trying to approach change and innovation and the future from the landscape of today is very similar to trying to peer into a room through the keyhole. If instead I walked into the room, I could see everything. So foresight allows us the opportunity to transport our audiences, our stakeholders, from today, from the present, into the future, from where they could see all types of opportunities. In the present, we're going to be held hostage by our preconceived notions of everything. And in fact, Google's done an extensive amount of research, and they estimate that 99.999996% of the data we process unconsciously, meaning we're relying on our old mental maps. So foresight allows us to break through those barriers and blind spots to really see potential new vistas. So at its core, this is what the discover phase is about. I mentioned causal layered analysis. Shout out to Sohail. I love this tool. This is my favorite foresight tool. It's been my favorite foresight tool since Frank Spencer showed it to me a zillion years ago. And if you're not familiar with it, it's available. A lot of information is available. Sohail's published a couple CLA readers. We're in one of them. But this is a great way to ensure that you're not staying at the tip of the iceberg with your analysis and your foresight work, but you're really diving deep into the root causes of an issue so that you can create transformative change. I will not even attempt to do CLA with the moments of time that I have left, but I wanted to highlight this tool as just a foundational foresight tool, especially when we're talking about assumptions and biases. In the explore phase, this is probably the phase that's most familiar to people as it relates to foresight. They think that we're just spotting trends, but it's much more than trends. We like to talk about this as futures intelligence. Of course, here we're conducting environmental scanning, and we're doing a lot of pattern and sense making. This is another foundational tool and framework within foresight, the idea of the 3 environments of foresight. So you've probably seen this before. The major takeaway here is that with foresight, unlike other insight practices, foresight works from the outside in, which means regardless of what my organization or my industry is, I'm scanning broadly across all macro drivers. And when you get good at this, you're able to see the signal from the noise and make sense of that deluge of data, but it's only then that you could progress inward. If instead you scan from the inside out, that's when you miss the future. That's when your biases and assumptions take hold and you're not able to see what's right in front of your face. So this 3 frameworks or 3 environments of foresight is critically important. And then the other thing I'll share as it relates to the explore phase is the fact that what I said earlier, we're not just looking at trends. We're looking at trends and we're analyzing trends to understand the value shifts that predicated those trends, as well as the implications that will result from it. So if you look at the innovation adoption curve and you layer on top of it where scanning occurs, you can see that if you only scan trends, you're at the late adopter, early majority level. You've already missed what's happening unless you can analyze those trends and see what's going to happen next, understand the value shifts where we're talking about really earlier on in the adoption curve. In MAP, again, most people are familiar with the mapping phase as it relates to scenarios. That's not the only tool within the mapping phase, although it is the most common and most famous. We believe futures wheels would fall under here, as well as our own scenario fields plug and play scenario tool. Here I wanted to share a couple of frameworks. The first is very, very popular, cone of possibilities. We like to call it the torch of the future because we love this analogy of a flashlight, where the light, of course, is very dense and focused near the bulb, which from a timing perspective, if you look at this graph, represents now. As we get further into time and the light disperses, there's more and more possible futures. And this is why we talk about not predicting the future, but mapping the future across these multiple potential futures. And the other thing I would point out here is that the plausible future, that center beam, becomes very, very small in the future, suggesting that those most likely futures that most of our strategic planning is based on are actually the least likely to happen. So this really points out why foresight is an incredible opportunity to upgrade traditional strategic planning processes. My background at Disney was in finance and in strategy, so I did my fair share of 5-year plans. They really lacked the ability for us to think in multiples and see past just an extrapolation of the past. There are many, many ways to create scenarios. This is a snapshot of a visual that we created to summarize some of those. There's, of course, the very famous 2x2 matrix, which has, in terms of benefits, that it's low resource requirement, but we really believe that the 2x2 matrix used alone is very reductionist. So it reduces the level of complexity to a point where it's actually inaccurate. So we have found ways through pattern building and our tool called scenario fields to create more inductive scenarios that don't take weeks or months to do. So I would encourage you all, as you're progressing through your foresight journey, to leverage scenarios, but to understand that scenarios aren't just a set of stories. In fact, that scenario building process started way back when you were doing discover and unconscious bias, because if you skip that phase, your scenarios are going to look like a lot like the present. Scenarios started back when you were doing scanning and recognizing trends and values, patterns, and implications, because your scenarios should include all of that data and fodder. So ultimately, scenarios are the culmination of really good foresight work when they're done well, and they can transport people into the future and help them rethink their assumptions and biases. Lastly, our create phase. Here's when we're talking about integration and making foresight the operating system that fuels everything that we do, whether it's change, R&D, everything within an organization or institution. This is where I give a plug to the fact that our foresight method, our natural foresight method, is developed on the basis of the Panarchy model, and which allows for better, more organic integration into complex environments. And so for those of you that are geeks about this, you have this visual, and then there's more. I'll give you a guide, a reference to a guide here in a moment that you could download to get even more information about it. And then for those of you that are like me, that just want to get things done, here's how I would look and showcase natural foresight in one process map. Again, depending on what you're trying to achieve, this is just one way that you can implement natural foresight. Again, beginning with unconscious bias modeling, of course, doing our trend prioritization. By the way, the entire time we're conducting scanning, we never stop scanning. We scan all the time. You can consider yourself a futurist and never create a scenario, but you cannot consider yourself a futurist, in my opinion, if you don't actively conduct scanning all the time. Once you've done that trend prioritization, you're creating those patterns which form the building blocks to our scenarios. And then ultimately, we want to use those scenarios to generate action in the present. So that's where strategic designs comes in. Ultimately, all of this information is made available. So that original item that I showed you, the primer, is a really short read. This is a comprehensive, over 100-page document that we made available when we launched our professional certification. It's called the Guide to the Natural Foresight Framework. It has everything and more about what you'd want to know about in terms of Discover, Explore, Map, Create, with lots of tools and support if you're interested in adding to your foresight practice. This is also a great tool if you're interested in pursuing professional certification. So with that, I will go back to this just so that you can see again. Of course, these slides will be made available in the recording, but I wanted to share again my contact information. So I am going to toggle over and see if I can see what Q&A we have here. Let's see. All right. David asked, what are the data available that futurists failed to identify? So I'm not sure if you're referring specifically to the current pandemic. I do know that from a COVID perspective and a Corona perspective, that there was data available to suggest that this pandemic was, possible. For me, it's less a failure of identifying data and more a failure of being able to express that data in a way that compelled people to act. We're not lacking data in our environment. We have more data than we know what to do with. And if it was just a question of data, we wouldn't be in half the messes we were in. You can ask two people on different ends of the political spectrum to interpret the same data. And if their biases come into play, they're going to interpret that data completely differently. So we know it's not just about data, it's about creating ways in which people can let go of biases, see the potential future, even if it seems very, very negative or even counterintuitive to them, and take action. Let's see. As you describe the foresight effort, I feel you speak about art. It is. So I'm not sure if this is, Julio, if this is referring to adaptive, resilient, and transformative, which we often talk about in terms of that acronym. And again, that really refers to creating leaders that are adaptive, resilient, and transformative, and organizations that are adaptive, resilient, and transformative. Resiliency allows us to weather a current storm. Adaptation allows us to pivot when faced with disruption. And transformation allows us to see opportunities where others only see threats and be able to achieve our higher order purpose. So that's what I would say about that. Do you mean that foresight clients prefer denial? They do prefer denial. I'm pretty sure about that. We often joke that that the name of our firm is Kedge, and that it's not the anchor that keeps you in place, although that we would be much more popular if it was. Our general tendency as human beings is to not want to embrace change. And this is the biggest, I think, hurdle for foresight professionals, is recognizing that you are change management professionals. And I know, again, that doesn't sound super sexy to most, but in fact, if you think about shepherding people through change and helping them accept what you see as obvious, that's the most important thing I think you can do as a futurist. How do we avoid, Jose says, how can we avoid the infodemic taking over the pandemic? With all the negative coverage, does it not look like the end of humanity? We need more optimism and vision. What else? Wherever Frank Spencer is right now, he is standing up and applauding this question, because he has been screaming this from the rafters, this idea that if we only have negative visions and negative narratives, then that's the future we're going to create. So it's not about ignoring the reality, but it is about avoiding this tendency that we have, especially in the media, to know that those type of negative headlines are what sell and what, drives clicks. So as futurists, I think it's our role, and Frank talked about it as our ethical responsibility, to look at the entire cone, to help understand and help our stakeholders and communities understand what is the consequence of inaction, but also show them and empower them and provide them the agency to understand that the decisions we make today are creating the future. So the future is not something that is happening to us, but rather the future is resulting from the actions or inactions that we take today. And making that connection, I think, is the most critical thing we can help our stakeholders do in order to avoid this, self-fulfilling prophecy of the world coming to an end as a result of what we're facing. So hopefully that helps answer your question. But Jose, I'm right with you. I have a question here. Would foresight benefit by transporting people into the past and use the present as a future to illustrate best practices versus current practices? Could this create a better understanding of the importance of strategic foresight? I love this idea. We actually have a historian on our staff currently. And so really looking at the timeline holistically and as a full picture is critically important. We have had the opportunity of trying to transport people to the past to help them, see what happened. The problem with it typically is that people aren't able to disconnect. They sort of know what happened. But if you can show them in a way where they're not already, understanding or already realizing what had happened, that could be helpful. We also, often do, situations where we don't even tell them that there are future scenarios. We just show them perhaps a clip of a film where it hasn't actually happened, but we present it as fact. And again, anything to help people, get past this idea that the future is going to reveal itself linearly from today. That's the critical part. So I think that there's many conventions from looking back to the past and going to the future and vice versa to look at the timeline more holistically. So absolutely, I agree. Could you talk about an example in the field of create? So create is, we sometimes talk about it in terms of the action that results from scenarios through scenario planning efforts, but that's really in the mapping phase. In create, we're talking about really implementing foresight. We're talking about, and it's going to depend on the situation. Work we did with Disney after I left Disney, we had the opportunity to work with the team at Walt Disney International for 4 or 5 years, where we trained over 500 leaders. Joanna Lenkova talked about this experience yesterday in her talk because she was one of the people that we trained. And ultimately, for that endeavor, and that case study is available. If you're interested, go ahead and email me or contact me. We can provide you the case study of the work that we did at Disney. But what was great about that is you could see how create was different in each region of the world. So in Japan, it looked different than in China, than it looked in Russia. In Russia, create looked like a complete overhaul of their 5-year plan strategic planning process to integrate scenario planning and scenarios. So they still did their Excel-based models, but they were informed and supported by good scenario work. So every region of the world in that case study, create took a different format, but ultimately create is about embedding foresight to make it sustainable. So it's not just a project, a department, or an initiative. It needs to be the way that we do things going forward. Excellent. So Helka asks, building foresight organizational culture and behaviors, the mindset, how to transfer the culture to the right direction as a leader, what things help to do it fast. Okay, I think I understand the question here. How to transfer the culture to the right direction as a leader. So ultimately, someone asked in one of the other sessions, how do you create the future of work? What are the critical skill sets of employees in the future? And so I'd like to sort of take that and connect it with this question. Ultimately, if you have an organization who has foresight embedded in the culture, they are equipped to not just learn, but learn, unlearn, and relearn. Meaning they're ready to let go of past ideas quickly in order to accept new realities. This doesn't happen overnight, but if you're able to develop this culture, then you as a leader really are just the orchestra conductor at that point. Decisions are being made at lower and lower levels of the organization. It's no longer enough to have a command and control leader with a ton of charisma and a ton of knowledge. Your individual employees and leadership at the lowest level have to be equipped with the ability to be resilient, adaptive, and transformative. And foresight is the best skill set to equip them now and into the future. Excellent. Tracy, hi Tracy. Do you think the pandemic and its negative effects will encourage more foresight or a possible backlash to futurists because the perception is we didn't predict it? Also, my feeling is the effects of this pandemic and the new world global viruses as could last a whole decade. What are your thoughts on lasting impact? I agree in your first question, as this could take one or the other. I've seen a lot of sort of ambulance chasing as professional foresight individuals try to pursue this pandemic. And I do think one of the reasons why I wanted to present this is to share with people that the signs were there, and that the failure is not in a failure of prediction, but it's a failure of imagination. And the pandemic serves as a really good example of what futurists need to focus on, which is changing hearts and minds, and being able to explain to people why they need to build this capacity within them. It's not just about producing glossy reports or cool scenarios. It's about doing the hard work of changing people's hearts and minds. How long will the effects of this pandemic? A long time. I think we'll definitely start to see a return to normalcy, hopefully by the end of this year. But similar to other major global situations, I think we'll feel the ripple effects of it for decades longer, and hopefully not just in a negative way. Hopefully there could be lasting impact where we have positive effects. Again, we're fond of telling people that we don't believe the pandemic is going to create transformation. If there's transformation resulting from this pandemic, it's because there was hard work done ahead of time to plant the seeds for that transformation. Doesn't mean that we can't take advantage of that hard work, but it's up to all of us to work together to be able to do that. So thank you for your question. As you say, the data was available. Do you consider this pandemic as a black swan or not? Ooh, lots of great debate about that online as well. We joke about black swans being more like black elephants, more like, it's the elephant in the room that no one wants to acknowledge. Certainly the size of this crisis and the way that it's played out, some might consider a black swan. If you look, for example, at the US response, none of us are surprised at how badly handled our federal government has handled this. When you vote in a reality star, this is what happens. So that was not surprising to us. So I want to sort of land on the side that I don't believe it was a black swan, but ultimately it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it's a failure in terms of the inability for people to accept that it was a possibility and do anything about it. So whether it gets classified as that is almost just semantics at that point. How will the world after COVID-19 use technology and losing more jobs? So I'm not sure what the question is here. Clearly, there's going to be economic impacts as it relates to the pandemic. But again, we were already seeing in many places across the world huge issues with economic disparity and fact that jobs weren't really providing the economic support that people needed. I think COVID-19 has put a very sharp and bright light on those issues, but in reality, they were already there. My hope is that we do see the benefit of some of the issues or some of the work that's been done even before the crisis. Let's see. What's the future of futures studies? Maybe this is more of a hope than my point of view. Our hope is that future of future studies is that it becomes further embedded. It becomes coursework that from kindergarten all the way through ongoing education is embedded in everything that we do. It is the only way that I think we are going to have success if we can really embed this type of thinking across our citizens, across our populace, and of course within our leaders. So I think I might have a couple more minutes. I know I'm just trying to be mindful, and there's lots and lots more questions. Where is the limit of patience to entertain with clients? That's a really good question, Christopher. It depends on the client. I guess it depends on what your level of patience is. We like to say that we meet people where they are, and we recognize that that one man's, plausible idea is another man's provocative idea. So I think it's really dependent on the situation. You definitely are not going to get success if people feel like you're, hitting them over the head with something. So we want to be mindful of that. So I think I want to say my time is up, because I know that we need to get on to the rest of the folks. So I just want to make sure that I'm not taking up too much time. So I don't know if
it's okay, Yvette. Yeah, you can take the last question, and
okay, great.
And then we close everything. Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Oh, can you share your email? Yes. Yvette at kedgefutures.com. That's Yvette, YVETTE at kedgefutures.com. Let's see. Does this, just really quickly, does this framework take into consideration degrowth and conscious collapse? It seems inherently conservative to try to maintain or transform versus preparing organizations for manageable self-destruction. That's way too long of a question, Mr. Vega, to answer on the couple minutes I have left. I would encourage you to take a look at the guide, and I think some of that will be captured in there. And then what is the most effective way that you found to share your work with the general public? We love doing sessions like this. We love making our materials available for free online. And so those are all ways when we do a session, even if it's a short session like this, we try to include tools and methodologies so that we can demystify the practice and help people begin applying it right away.